Okay, so let's actually talk about our lens settings. The first item within our lens settings is a perspective lens, I guess. This best mimics what we are used to seeing. So perspective is a little tough to define, but it has to do with how things appear relative to one another. So for example, if I move really close to this Google Home Mini, we see the charger in the background. Now the charger is smaller than this Google Home Mini. But if I bring my camera really close to the charger and we have a fairly extreme perspective or a long focal length, we can make it look like the charger is much bigger than the Google Home Mini itself. So that has to do with perspective. It's also the reason why when you stand at the base of a tall building, the top of the building seems to be kind of skinnier, or like the edges taper toward the top of the building. Next, we have something called orthographic. Orthographic gets rid of perspective. It is what you're used to seeing if you spend a lot of time modeling in a 3D CAD application. So if we look at this from the top, we'll see a perfect circle. It won't distort at all. And we're not going to have objects seeming to taper off as they get further from the camera. Whereas when I go to perspective, you will see that change take place. Orthographic is good if you want a very linear appearance, but it's never going to look as realistic as perspective because we don't see things in a orthographic mode. So in this cube, if we, let's go ahead and go to a smaller focal length, what you're gonna notice is it does what you see when you stand at the base of a building. It looks like as it goes up toward the top, these vertical edges kind of, they start to converge, they start to come together. If you draw a line from this edge into infinity, eventually all of these edges will converge, or these lines will. This is perspective. Now, when your point of view is below the horizon line, the vertical edges will converge above the horizon line. When you move above the horizon line, the vertical edges will diverge above the horizon line and they will converge below the horizon line. So let's say you have this wide angle lens to try to show the interior of a room or a building, or you're using this wide angle to capture a lot of a wide field of view, but you don't like how the edges are converging, these vertical edges. It's very distracting, especially toward the edge of a rendering. This creates a very uncomfortable tension near the edge of the frame. We can fix this using something called shift. When I click Estimate Vertical Shift, it's going to straighten that line up and they all become parallel, removing that ugly, distracting distortion. And now we can play with our field of view and our vertical and horizontal shift to recenter the frame. And this is a nice way if you have a lot of rectilinear objects. Think phone cases, washing machines, iPads, computers, whatever. Shift can be a good way to capture a wide field of view and then remove that distortion. But know that the wider your view is, the lower the perspective, the more distortion it will apply to the model to compensate for that, especially toward the edges of the frame. Next, we have something called panoramic, which you're not really going to use unless you've got like a head-mounted display or you're doing some sort of VR stuff, or perhaps rendering out a 2:1 aspect ratio panoramic rendering to be used as an HDRI. Remember, we talked about HDRIs and how they are at a 2:1 panoramic ratio. These are done using this panoramic sort of setup. Now you'll see in our perspective, orthographic, and shift lens settings, we all have this match perspective button. This is a tool that is supposed to help you figure out what lens settings to use to make your product fit into a photographic backplate. So remember we talked about backplates. If I were to put this bench scene backplate into our real-time view, and I want to make the cube look like it's sitting on the bench with the right settings, I would use this match perspective tool. And you get all these lines, and these lines are guides that you're supposed to use to try to align the product with the scene. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and use these vertical lines and try to quickly see if I can align them to some of the objects in our scene. And to make this more accurate, you want to make sure that you're applying these lines or lining them up to the longest possible object you can, but also items that are square, which is why I'm using this bench, because it's got some nice square edges. All right, and right here you can see we have basically dialed it in. I'm gonna hit this green checkbox, and it gave us a perspective focal length of 27-ish millimeters, which is very wide, but from here I can go and now try to position the camera in such a way that the cube seems to blend into the scene and it's got the appropriate amount of perspective distortion applied to it.